Hi, good evening. It is Tuesday, February 2nd, and this is the third plenary lecture in our series for the Montana course, Honors 291. Tonight, we have the honor of having Professor Rafael Chacón from Art History speaking to us about visualizing Montana's history through the arts. And I'm going to pause the recording here until we're ready to get the class started. So I want to welcome Rafael Chacón, a longtime friend of mine, professor of art history, also one of our museum curators here. And we have two people to introduce him tonight. I'm going to invite Hannah up to the microphone first, and then she'll start with the introduction, and then Ray Combs is also there on Zoom land there. So if you want to start ahead, Hannah?
Ready?
And speak real close to the mic.
Yeah, okay, cool. All right. Dr. Rafael Chacón is the Bruce and Susan Crocker Director of the Montana Museum of Art and Culture, and also the Professor of Art and History and Criticism in the School of Visual and Media Arts at the university here. He holds a bachelor's degree in art from Wabash College with a master's and PhD in art history with honors from the University of Chicago. Dr. Chacón has taught many courses on art history and criticism throughout the last 25 years and was just recently named one of the top 10 lecturers by the Smithsonian Institute's Global Travel Program.
All right, thank you, Hannah. Now, Ray, if you want to unmute yourself and continue with that.
Dr. Chacón's academic research lies in American architectural history, historic preservation, and Montana history, especially its visual arts. He has published many articles and books in these areas. His newfound passion, however, is for vexillology, I hope I said that correctly, the study of flags, having received the top awards for his research at recent international and national conferences, the Whitney Smith Award for the top paper presented at the International Federation of Vexillological Associations Congress in 2019, and the Captain William Driver Award at the North American Vexillological Association Conference in 2016. Dr. Chacón, welcome to Honors 291, the Montana course. We're glad to have you.
Great. Thank you so much, Ray and Hannah. And so at this point, Rafael, if you want to go ahead and use the share screen, we'll make sure that I got the projector on the TV screen here as well. All right, we got it up here. Ray, can you give me a thumbs up if you can see it on your Zoom land there? Great. All right.
Good to go, Dan.
Very good. Then, Rafael, we're going to turn it over to you, and I'm going to monitor the chat screen, things like that, but we will let you take it away.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Spencer. Thanks, Hannah and Ray. Ray, I'm impressed with the way you said vexillology. You even said vexillological correctly. Nicely done. Maybe we might even have a new convert to the study of flags. So thank you. Well, thank you to all of you for being here, and certainly to Professor Spencer for this wonderful invitation. I'm honored, humbled by the invitation to address you guys tonight. So the topic that I'm speaking about is called Visualizing Montana's History Through the Arts. And I know we're sort of in the rudiments in your course, in your conversations about Montana. This conversation about how we define this great state is only going to get richer for you. And I hope that what I do today is actually to expand that, that definition to include the visual arts, because we have an incredible art community all around us, but a significant community that is, in many ways has helped to shape and define this place as powerfully as words and politics and statements and documents have. So I honestly believe that our visual history is as powerful and as important, as impressive as any text that we have that we use to define and tell us what Montana is about. So let me first begin by telling you what this lecture, this discussion is not. It's obviously not going to be a comprehensive or even an in-depth view of our art history. It's too deep, it's too old, it's too rich for us to do this in the matter of an hour. And I understand, for example, that you've already begun by having conversations about Montana's indigenous history, which is of course vast and deep and profound as well. And so in the course of this conversation, we're not going to be able to go back in time into that history and to do it justice in the course of an hour. So I do want to recommend that if you are interested in understanding sort of our art history, to read the scholars who write about Montana's indigenous history, as well as the historians like Professor Dan Flores in history, who have addressed our arts, our visual heritage over the last, at least the last 120, 25 years. So this is not what we're going to do tonight. This is also not, as my title implies, an illustrated history of Montana's history. We're not going to put images to that incredibly rich history with the labor struggles and the Indian Wars and the resource extraction. I mean, Montana has a very, very, very rich history. This is not a visual illustration of that history. So that's point number 2. So what are we going to do this evening? Well, what I'd like to do is to give you a more impressionistic look at how the visual arts, that is art, and to a certain extent how architecture, at least in the last 125 to 150 years, has to a certain extent helped to define Montana. That these elements, these two human arenas, very important human arenas, art and architecture, have played a significant role in defining us, in shaping what Montana is, and more specifically, who Montana is. So that's my aim for this evening. So I apologize if there are gaps in this PowerPoint, in this presentation, and bear with me a second here. It's not advancing. So just 1 second. Okay. Oh, here we go. I'm going to use that arrow. Okay, so it's appropriate then for us to remind ourselves that our arts have been here forever, and that Montana's arts really began with the indigenous peoples of this place, and that it's an infinitesimal amount of time of recorded human history here that is represented by those arts. And so really our first layer, if you will, of arts is very deep and it's very profound. And then of course the art that has laid on top of that is of course the post-colonialist art, that is our territorial art and our early statehood art, and then the art of primarily the 20th century. That is, that in some ways we're going to explore this evening to talk about how these things have helped to define us as a place. So it's also appropriate to begin with probably this individual, and this is the man who I think has gone farthest to define Montana through the visual arts. And of course, that's the famous Great Falls artist, Charlie M. Russell, who was, by the way, not a Montanan. He's from St. Louis, and he came out here as a young man and then ultimately became the quintessential Montanan. And his art, in some ways, put a very deep imprint on what we think of as Montana as a place, and what our arts are all about. So he is a foundational artist, and I call him a definitional artist because his art has really defined us. And there's 2 images here, one showing him in his studio painting, and then of course the wonderful statue of him, which is in the rotunda in Statuary Hall of the U.S. Capitol building. So he has literally taken Montana to Washington, D.C. and beyond, and has come to represent in some ways the quintessential Montanan. So it's this image that in some ways is sort of emblazoned on everybody's minds around the world when they think of Montana. They think of the great open, they think of the big sky, they think of these vast, free and open landscapes. And it is landscape art that really has helped to define Montana and to put our arts kind of on a global stage. But more importantly, beyond the place, the physicality of the place, it's this scene, these kinds of scenes that in some ways have shaped the world's notion of what Montana is. It's the cowboy bucking a bronco. It is in fact the settler's camp. It is the rugged, rustic homespun hero, a place of rugged individualism that is represented by the art of Charlie Russell. It's a fiction. It's in fact an invented story. It is not a real image of Montana as it was in the 19th century or in the early 20th century. It's in fact a romanticization on the part of an artist who sort of idealized the life of the ranch hand and the cowboy, a life that he chose for himself. I mean, he had actually quite a privileged upbringing. He had, in fact, a very extensive education, and yet he created himself into this intentional rustic, a man of the land, a man of this kind of burgeoning new place in his mind. And so Russell, through his creations, and by the way, he had a partner in this, and that is the wife, Anna, who you see there in the image in the upper right. So there was a kind of collusion here to create a certain image of the state of Montana that is very much the kind of life that Charlie Russell wished that he could live. Much of his imagery of the cowboy and the Indian, because both of these two things went hand in hand for him, were really romanticizations of a past that was already disappearing on the Great Plains. It was a life, the life that he recorded in those images really were a kind of fictional version of a place that was no more, a place that it was being transformed dramatically particularly in the early 20th century by industrialization and population growth and this kind of expanding extract economies that were in fact that controlled and monopolized and dictated what life in Montana was like at the turn of the last century. So at the threshold of the modern age, Russell looked backwards. He looked backwards into an age that was already a romanticization, a fictionalization, if you will, of Montana, and he promoted that, and he was very, very successful at it. He wasn't alone. There were a whole slew of artists who, in fact, participated in this process. And what you're looking at is, in fact, the visual version of Manifest Destiny. So we know Manifest Destiny, of course, is the ideology that motivated thousands, perhaps millions of people to move from the eastern seaboard and the states of the eastern half of America to the west. And it drew them here by divine right, by, in fact, divine choice. God had, in fact, given them these lands, and they were there for the taking, at least in the perception of people, individuals in the 19th century. Russell and his ilk, artists, used the visual arts to promote this idea of manifest destiny, to romanticize the landscape, to promote the idea that the land was emptied and open and accessible to Anglo-Americans, European Americans of all stripes in the early 20th century, in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. So I'm just showing you two photographic images of that era. And these are, again, visualizations, if you will, of the concept of the ideology of manifest destiny. And painters, by the way, had been about this for a long, long time, idealizing, glorifying the West, and depicting a certain version of the West. And this is what we see in the work of Albert Bierstadt, painters like Thomas Moran. Here, let me show you, let me jump ahead and show you Thomas Moran. A number of Eastern Seaboard artists, mostly from New York State, but some from places like Pittsburgh and Boston and other of our America's Eastern Seaboard cities, who came west and created this image of the West. Again, beautiful, gorgeous, majestic landscapes, particularly mountain landscapes, but landscapes that were to Eastern eyes, to the eyes of Americans in the Eastern Seaboard, an open landscape, a virginal landscape, a landscape that was in fact free and open for the taking. And these paintings, in fact, motivated people to go west, as the slogan said. And there was only one little impediment to all that, besides the hardship of actually surviving and living in the West. That little impediment was what you see in the foreground of Albert Bierstadt's painting, and that's the Indian. So for a good portion of the 19th century, artists had to reckon with what to do with the Indian, and their images of the Indian are all over the place. From a kind of pastoral scene in which the Indian encampment is seen as a safe and inviting place, a camp where you would want to go in and see children playing and dogs running and adults tending horses and parlaying and talking and exchanging goods or whatever. I mean, there is nothing in this image that would tell us that this is a dangerous place, a scary place, a forbidding place, or a place that's uninviting. In fact, the image does the opposite. So these paintings were ideologically motivated, and they supported the concept that these lands were in fact free and open for the taking, and that this was in fact a God-given right for all American citizens. So that's, and all along the while, there were physical steps being taken in order to make sure that that dream could come true. And so the industrialization of the West, the extension of the railway, I mean, these things actually made it possible, ultimately made it possible for the West to be literally taken. And our visual arts recorded that quite eloquently, both in paintings, but also in photographs. And these are photographs from the late 19th century that show Montana as it was being transformed. So Charlie Russell was in fact a product of his age. And in fact, he rejected much of what we see here in favor of a view backwards into an earlier age, a more primitive age in his mind, an age when there weren't machines to in fact settle and tame, quote unquote, these lands. So he was quite motivated to in fact inspire people to come west, but he was inspiring people by this kind of romantic notion of the West. And some of these images that you see here, in fact, are evidence of that. William Henry Jackson, the man you see there seated in that rail car on the right, this is his personal rail car, by the way, surrounded by his photographs, gave a very, very impressive speech in Chicago in 1893 about the closing of the West. He basically said in his great speech that the West was now hermetically sealed and it was ours. It was America's great victorious conquest. And his photographs, the photographs that you actually see here of Montana, these are places in Yellowstone Park or very near and dear to us. Those places were in fact being used now. Photography in some ways had replaced the visual arts to promote people coming west, to literally come to settle, homestead, take, to civilize the wild and woolly lands of our great state. So images, both painterly images like the one that you see here by Thomas Moran, or photographic images like those of the same place that you see here by William Henry Jackson, were tools, if you will, in the hands of Manifest Destiny. And I don't know to what extent artists were willing participants in all this, but they certainly benefited from this, because they sold these images and they certainly made their life at it. There was, by the way, a conscience among many of these artists. A lot of them understood that in the process of settling the West and transforming the West, industrializing the West, that they were in fact ruining it. And for that, I want to read to you a quote. And this is actually from Thomas Cole, who was an American painter in upstate New York, writing in the 1830s. And this text to me is chilling, because this was literally written in the 1830s, and it would predict what would happen in the West in places like Montana at a rampant pace later in the century. Here's Thomas Cole. He says, "I cannot but express my sorrow that the beauty of such landscapes are quickly passing away. The ravages of the axe are daily increasing. The most noble scenes are made desolate, and oftentimes with such a wantonness and barbarism scarcely credible in a civilized nation. The wayside is becoming shadeless, and another generation will behold spots now rife with beauty, desecrated by what we call development." I mean, it's hard to imagine. This was written in 1835, back there in the Eastern Seaboard. And it was an amazing prophetic statement about what was coming, not just back in upstate New York, but what was coming out here, certainly. So this is Charlie Russell's Montana. It's not these idyllic, beautiful, open landscapes, you know, with beneficent Indians awaiting gladly for European and Anglo-Americans to arrive. Montana was already, at the time of Charlie Russell's paintings, in the first 2 decades of the 20th century, looked like this. This is Lewis and Clark County. This is, I believe, Virginia City. So what we're looking at is a place where already forestry had already taken off, the railroad industry had already taken off, the mining industry was going gung-ho, that those places that Thomas Cole said were beautiful, rife with beauty, were already being desecrated, to use his term, by progress and what we called in 1835 development. So he sounds like a modern, more like a modern eco-terrorist or at least an environmentalist than he does like a 19th century writer. Romantic writer. So anyway, a very interesting thing happens to our notions of the West. Our artists are promoting this image of this idyllic romantic landscape in which the Indian is still free, when the world actually was very different, when the prospects for the average Indian was in fact severely limited, where life was incredibly difficult and hard for those early homesteaders and those settlers in the West. The West did not stop being the harsh environment with extremes of temperature and extremes of weather, et cetera, that we know and respect. The West was a tough place. And for every homesteader who made it, there were 10 who turned around and went back, or who failed and were buried in under the Montana soil. So these images that we have, the very earliest art, sort of Western art that we have, are in fact promoting a kind of fictional, romanticized Montana. And Charlie Russell was not alone in this. Frederick Remington, the artist, certainly was doing it. Lots of artists from here all the way back to Washington, D.C. were creating images like these that idealized, heroicized the Indians, the very Indians that we were working very actively to destroy, whose cultures, whose traditions, whose ways of life we were actively denigrating, if not eradicating. So this is a very troubling notion that our arts, in fact, are giving us a mixed message. They're confusing in some ways the reality, and they're certainly not depicting the real world. They're depicting their notions of the real world. And those, of course, all have to be read through not an objective lens, but have to be read through their subjectivity. So this is a very interesting image. This is Buffalo Bill with Indians in the city of Venice in Europe. It's a stunning image to think of Native Americans actually traveling abroad with Buffalo Bill, Americans, if you will, in Europe, in old Europe. And yet there's something very tragic about this image, this idea of parading Indians as tokens or as mascots of images of savagery and barbarism and old primitive ways of life that are disappearing before us. I mean, there's a sort of strange eeriness about this image from the year 1900. And images like these, which I think of as incredibly respectful and honoring, if you will, of the people and the place. These are the photos of Edward Curtis, were in some ways also falsifying reality, because these images are staged. Edward Curtis actually staged these images. Sometimes, having members of one group, one people's, one tribe, wearing the articles of clothing of another tribe because they look better in the photographs. The images that you see here, this is actually on the right, that's Flathead Lake. And that way of life that you see there in this photograph from 1909 was really at the end of its lifespan. The lake had already been divided, the lake had already been subdivided and sold off. The lake shore was being sold off as we speak. And this image that you see there on the right was intentionally staged to look backwards, not to look at the present reality of life in Montana. So an image like this that I opened my lecture with, we have to take with a grain of salt. It's beautiful, there's no question about it. It's gorgeous, it's stunning. It might even be archaeologically or even anthropologically correct. And of course, I give Charlie Russell a great deal of credit because he's, unlike many artists who distorted the history of indigenous Montana, he actually was quite respectful of it and worked very hard to get it right. And I think that his life and these images were based on relationships, real relationships in the community that he inhabited. But the image as a whole, in some ways, you cannot be seen as an accurate image of Indian life in 1911. I mean, it is in fact a romanticization or an idealization are the two terms that I've used before. And there's another interesting thing, and that is that while Charlie Russell gave us this beautiful, realistic, very plausible image, he was way out of sync with contemporary art. And what he was saying about Montana's art is that we were retardataire. We were actually quite retrograde, because he is painting in 1911 as if this did not happen in 1907. In other words, as if Montana existed separate from the modern world. And of course, what had happened is that the world, particularly the world of art, has shifted far away from romanticized images like we see in Charlie Russell. Charlie Russell was working in a very, very old-fashioned style. And so the first images that we have of Montana are actually very, very old-fashioned, rather than modern and contemporary. So, so while Charlie Russell was doing this, creating images like that, this is what the rest of the world was doing, at least what Western Europe was doing. So this is the futurist artist Umberto Boccioni, giving us a radically different vision of art in the early 20th century. So Montana, our arts were way out of sync with what was actually happening at the avant-garde, at the cutting edge of contemporary art. And that tension we're going to see in Montana's art throughout the 20th century. There were other players who, by the way, did their share to romanticize the state and to create an image of the state. And this is one of them right there. This is J.J. Hill, Jerome Hill, the founder and the owner of the Great Northern Railway, a man who in some ways created one of the more important rail lines in North America. And there actually you see the line running from Chicago through St. Paul, Minneapolis, all the way up along the High Line, or just below the High Line, across Montana, with spurs going down to Great Falls, and then going all the way to Seattle and Portland, and then further down to California. They also owned steamships that went across the Pacific to Asia. And that railway played an enormous role, in fact, in crafting an image of what Montana was. The Hills, that is father JJ and son Lewis Hill, whom you see here in the upper right, became great publicists for Montana, particularly for Glacier National Park. They understood that this park, the crown of the continent, would become, if it became a national park, that this land, this kind of majestic territory just north of us here in Missoula, would become, in fact, the magnet that would draw paying customers from back east. And so these guys became great marketeers, America's first great PR guys, and they sold Montana to the rest of the country. And they sold it through the visual arts. They hired artists and photographers to come to Glacier, to paint in Glacier, to depict Glacier, and to send these images back along the rail line in their train stations, in their depots. They put these paintings in church halls and in fraternal societies, anywhere where there were people with money who would be interested in coming west, coming to fish, coming to hike, coming to encounter Indians. This is what they sold. The Hills and the Great Northern Railway sold Montana, and they shaped Montana. In fact, they built Montana. They certainly built Glacier National Park. The lodges that you see in Glacier today were really a product of very, very clever marketing on the part of JJ and Lewis Hill. This is Glacier Park Lodge, the first lodge that they built, which was outside the lodge. Actually, let me take you back here. It was built on the Blackfeet Indian Reservation, not in Glacier National Park. It was just outside the park, but it became, in some ways, the beachhead. It became the place in which you would enter, and all the services in the park were at that point provided by the Great Northern Railway. So a string of chalets and a string of outfitters, backpacking trips, fishing trips, a series of gourmet chalets and camps and teepee camps inside the park and the trail system, the vast and enormous trail system developed by the park in order to lure more and more tourists here. And what they were saying actually architecturally, in a minute I'll show you the art that they promoted, but what they were saying architecturally is that this is an American version of Switzerland. This architecture, by the way, these amazing rustic lodges that we all love at Glacier National Park, this is not Montana architecture. This is Swiss architecture, brought to the West, brought to the Northwest, implanted, if you will, on this landscape. And yeah, it's made out of rustic timbers, it's made out of rustic materials, but it is an architectural language from Western Europe, from the Alpine country of France and Switzerland and Italy. It is not American architecture. And yet it was implanted, it was brought, laid on top of this in the same way that Charlie Russell will lay Western style painting on top of this landscape. It romanticizes this place in a bizarre kind of way. Actually, this is very interesting. You'll notice those Japanese lanterns inside Glacier Park Lodge. And you wonder, what the hell are Japanese lanterns doing there? Well, among paintings, among Indian artifacts, among taxiderm mounts, the Great Northern Railway also put up Japanese lanterns and parasols and all kinds of paraphernalia from Asia. Why? It's because they wanted to encourage people, once they got to Montana, to continue going west, go to Seattle. And when you get to Seattle, make sure you get on a steamship and go all the way across the Pacific to Japan at the, you know, at the care of the Great Northern Railway. I mean, really incredible marketing. So Montana was strangely cosmopolitan in the day, even though it was for these folks a new place, a young place. This is the lobby of the Many Glacier Hotel, the first lodge that the Great Northern was allowed to build inside the park. And of course, these are some of the chalets that they built throughout the park. I mean, it must have been a kind of dissonant thing to have these Swiss-style buildings with, you know, people wearing Germanic dirndls and all kinds of odd European-style clothing in Montana, of all places. And the railway also hired artists like John Ferry, who was an Impressionist artist, an Austrian Impressionist, brought here, paid for by the Great Northern to paint these majestic landscapes. And his paintings, these large sweeping views of the park, the national park as it had just come into being, were used, in fact, as propaganda for this place. And they, in fact, it's these paintings that then became the celebrated image of our place for the rest of the world. Because these paintings, by the way, weren't made for Glacier National Park. They were actually meant for St. Paul. They were meant for Des Moines. They were meant for Chicago. They were meant for Baltimore. They were meant to bring people from those places here. So this is one that's in our collection at the U of M at the Montana Museum of Art and Culture. This is the same painter, John Ferry, this beautiful view of Gunsight Pass. So two things are happening here. One is obviously the romanticization of the cowboy and Indian way of life. But another one is the romanticization of our landscapes, seeing them as majestic, as powerful, as beautiful, as desirable, as the most desirable lands in North America. And they're being marketed, they're being sold. And people are making a buck off of these images. Certainly the Great Northern Railway capitalized on, and they, by the way, they paid artists very little money for these images, but they used those images to cash in on this. And that's, of course, that's the American way. It was entrepreneurial, but it was also ideological. And it shaped, in fact, the world's image of us. This is another artist, a glacier artist, an artist hired by the Great Northern Railway. This is the German artist Winold Reiss. And Reiss actually came and he actually painted what are now called the Glacier Indians. That is mostly members of the Blackfeet tribe, members of who lived on the reservation outside of Glacier on the east side of the divide. And these folks were in fact painted by Reiss for the Great Northern. The Great Northern actually bought almost all of these paintings and then turned them into calendars, which were seen widely all across America, all across the world, really. So it was the land and these people, that is Montana's Indians, that really were in fact the images that were carried forth from here, carried forth by people associated with the Great Northern Railway. And lots of other artists followed suit. This is another work, and by the way, there's a little bit of selfless self-promotion here. I'm going to show you a number of works that are in the collection of the Montana Museum of Art and Culture, just so that you get a sense of the richness of your collections, because these arts all belong to the state of Montana. They belong to you, its citizens. And we at the Montana Museum of Art and Culture are really just stewards of these works of art for the state. artists like Fray Dana, another amazing impressionist artist who came west, settled here in Montana, and painted images like this image of this Plains chief. But remember that these arts are thoroughly retrograde, that they're not looking forward. They're not even looking to the present. They're looking backwards. This is what a contemporary art looked like at the same time that Fray Dana painted this image. The world had left us far behind in the dust. They were no longer, the rest of the world had embraced abstraction. They had embraced non-objectivity in art. Art had become about something else. And it was certainly not about romantic images of Indians. So we were definitely behind the times, if you will. And of course, given our remoteness, given our distance from Russia or France or Paris or London or whatever, it makes sense. We were still, quite remote. So Russell was not alone in rejecting modern art. In fact, he was a number of American artists all across the country, not just here in the West, who in fact were kind of averse and had a great fear of modern art. So I'm going to show you some of the big problems that America had with contemporary art. This was an exhibition that was held in 1913. At the same time that Charlie Russell was painting Indians, cowboys and Indians, like the ones that we just saw, and Ferry was painting beautiful sweeping landscapes, majestic landscapes of glacier, modern art had moved well beyond that. And that's what this show in New York City attempted to demonstrate to Americans. That yes, there were artists who were doing images like the one that you see here, sculpting beautiful representational nudes. But then there were also artists who were abstracting the figure and abstracting the landscape and abstracting art in general. Artists like Pablo Picasso, for example, or Georges Braque, the Frenchman. So the arts had advanced way beyond the kind of images that you see in Montana early in the 20th century. So this painting was the celebrated painting from that exhibition in 1913 held in New York City of contemporary art in France. This is Marcel Duchamp's celebrated painting of a nude descending a staircase. And this is actually a Cubist painting, and it's actually the first Cubist painting, like Picasso's painting, that actually shows motion. And this was radical. Most Americans who saw this couldn't understand what they were looking at. They had no idea what they were looking at. And the title, Nude Descending a Staircase, didn't help them any. And as evidence of that, here is in fact a newspaper reporter's response to that. He called this a rude descending the staircase, rush hour at the subway, New York, and this was published in the New York Evening Sun. So he interprets this image of a nude descending a staircase in this Cubist style as a rude descending a staircase in the subway. Or this is the President Roosevelt wrote about this, seeing this painting. And let me just read to you a little quotation from Teddy Roosevelt. He says, take the picture. Actually, I should probably do it in his style. So take the picture, which for some reason is called A Naked Man Going Downstairs. Actually, I'll stop with the impersonation. Teddy Roosevelt wrote about art, and he actually wrote a critique of that painting. So he says, take the picture which for some reason is called A Naked Man Going Downstairs. There is in my bathroom a really good Navajo rug, which on any proper interpretation of the Cubist theory is a far more satisfactory and decorative picture. Now, if for some inscrutable reason it suited somebody to call this rug a picture of, say, a well-dressed man going up a ladder, the name would fit the facts just about as well as the case of the Cubist picture of the naked man going downstairs. From the standpoint of terminology, each name would have whatever merit adheres in a rather cheap straining after effect. And from the standpoint of decorative value, of sincerity, and of artistic merit, the Navajo rug is infinitely ahead of the picture. So I think Teddy Roosevelt had a problem with Cubism. Okay? So I'm just saying, Charlie Russell may be giving us interesting, clever, beautiful, maybe even accurate images of the West, but he is way out of sync with modern art. That's not to say that all artists in Montana were out of sync with modern art. Some of them actually tried to bridge to modernity. Even Winold Reiss, the glacier artist on the right, was in some ways making an attempt at that. Julius Seiler, another German artist who traveled in the plains of Montana, made an attempt through his abstractions of Indian life. So there were some artists doing it, but in fact, the majority of artists were following in Charlie Russell's footsteps, and in fact, just couldn't do it. Could not take us to the place of abstraction and modernism. Russell in 1914 went to Europe, and he saw futurist art. In fact, here he is. This is a sketch, a note from his letters, where he's actually talking to a futurist artist who's displaying a modern art, and Charlie Russell is responding. And I just want to read very quickly what he says about this experience. He said, this guy, this futurist, led me up to something in a frame that looked like an enlarged slice of spoiled summer sausage, and said, this is not disintegration of simultaneousness, but dynamic dynamism. And it did look like that. Another he showed me as near I could make from his talk represented the feeling of a bad stomach after a duck lunch. So Charlie Russell, this is the painting, by the way, that he's describing, an Italian futurist painting. So this is modern art. Charlie Russell argued against modern art, either because it looked like spoiled summer sausage or because he just couldn't understand it. By the way, I don't know if you can see, there's a horse and rider here in this futurist painting, only it's abstracted in the modernist sense. This is another one of the paintings that Charlie Russell saw in that show in London in 1914. And I like to think that even though Charlie Russell spoke against this art, that it transformed his art. This is what his painting looked like after he returned from that exhibition. And I hope you can see that there is actually a relationship between what he saw in London and what he actually winds up doing in his later painting. I mean, I see a lot of drama, I see a lot of movement, and I certainly see a kind of bombastic sense of color that you don't see in his early work. So the majority of Montana's artists, John Ferry at Glacier, Charlie Russell, even Edgar Paxson in Missoula, and that's him right there. And by the way, these are paintings that are in the Montana Museum of Art and Culture, done by Edgar Paxson, our own homegrown artist here. These artists were in fact painting out of sync with the rest of the world. They were in fact stuck in a kind of romantic rut about the West and about the way things used to be. And that, of course, will change dramatically in the 20th century, because there are going to be these pushes forward into, in fact, describe the reality of the West. This is a print in our collection done by Thomas Hart Benton, the great American artist, who's actually, he's well known for these prints, but he's actually better known for his paintings of America's landscapes and its people. And all the way through the Great Depression in the 1930s, what Thomas Hart Benton argued for is what you see in this quote. He said, "We wanted an American art which was not empty. This Americanist period had for many facets some dark, repressive, and suggestive of an ugly neo-fascism. But on the whole, it was a time of general improvement in democratic idealism. We symbolized aesthetically what Americans had in mind, America itself. Our success was popular success." In other words, what he's saying is that he wanted an American art for Americans, an art that didn't look like European abstraction, but looked like America. That was a realistic representation of us. And by the way, this is not Montana, but it could well easily have been Glasgow or any part in eastern Montana or on the plains. This was America's reality. It was boomtown. It was the petroleum industry. It was the railroad industry. What Thomas Hart Benton did was he said, listen, the West is in fact not this romantic Charlie Russell land. It is not this romantic, beautiful glacier land. It is this. It's raucous. It's wild. It's crazy. And in fact, American artists, particularly in the Great Depression during the 1930s, actually changed our notions of what Western art was. And in fact, gave us images like these kind of epic, sweeping landscapes filled with the Americans. So this is, by the way, Thomas Hart Benton's work, what he's really famous for. These epic murals done in public buildings, in courthouses, Capitol buildings, high schools, gymnasiums, post offices. This is what the American art in the 1930s was all about. And this diffused throughout the country. This style that was both a little bit 19th century, a little bit modern, but mostly it was in fact a kind of happy middle, a kind of democratic and idealistic image of America. And this is all over Montana. This, for example, is an image of the artist Elizabeth Lockery painting in Dillon these kind of Benton style murals. And these are all over our rural post offices in the state, and our gymnasiums have these things, and our high schools have them. There's in East Missoula, actually in Bonner, we have a series of these murals from the 1930s done by a professor at the University of Montana. So in some ways, the image, the romantic image of Montana that Charlie Russell imprinted on us survived through this period of the Depression in artists like Elizabeth Lockery. And this is another one in our museum. But it was really left up to the professors at U of M and the professors teaching all around the state and other institutions to, in fact, teach students about the real world, to teach students about what was actually happening in the arts. So artists like Aidan Arnold, who you see here on the 4th floor of the Fine Arts Building at the University of Montana in 1958, were the people who actually promoted modern art. And they tried to breach this gap that had existed early in the 20th century between artists like Russell and the rest of the world. So these are both professors at U of M. They're painting professors back in the day when the painting professors wore suits to class. But anyway, and you can see from the paintings that they're holding that really what they're teaching their students is in fact about modern art. And so it's these folks that I think of as transformative in some ways more so than people like Charlie Russell. They actually taught generations of artists all around the state about the values of modernity. And that's not to say that they didn't continue the traditions of defining Montana and depicting Montana for us. For example, these are Aidan Arnold's sort of his take on the cowboy and his take on the Montana hunter, et cetera. But there, as you can see, they've been filtered now through the lens of modernity, through the lens of Cubism. And it's these are the lessons that Aidan Arnold would promote with the students in the 1940s, 50s, and into the 1960s. So really, it's the academic centers in Montana, MSU certainly, at U of M certainly, where a number of interesting professors, in fact, promoted modern art here and transformed the landscape, and intentionally peeled students away from Charlie Russell and the first half of the 20th century. Frances Senska taught ceramics at Bozeman at MSU. And subsequently, she went on to teach Peter Volkus at MSU and Rudy Audio at MSU. So these guys, these two artists alone would transform American ceramics across the country from lovely pots to abstract expressionist modernist art. So this is early Rudy Audio. Again, these are works that are in our collection here at U of M. This is work that he did after leaving MSU, after coming to become the chair of the art program at U of M. In some ways transforming us into an avant-garde center. Eventually his art wound up looking like this, and that's really what Rudy Audio is known for. But in the interim, he had actually gone through a kind of modernist abstract moment. This was catch up. This was, in fact, bringing Montana up to speed with what the rest of the world. And really, it's our faculty and our students that have done the most active part of that have connected our arts to the rest of the world, certainly in the second half of the 20th century and into the beginning of the 21st. So I'm going to end this talk by showing you some of the work of the faculty at U of M and how, in fact, they've expanded. In some ways, they've given up on this idea of defining Montana, not all of them. The earlier artists, in fact, made the statement about what Montana was. These folks, these faculty members, these artists, these professional artists today have reformed and transfigured that image of Montana. This is my colleague Beth Lowe, who taught for many years in the program, a protege of Rudy Audio's, a protege of Peter Volkus, who has transformed ceramics in the state through her own work. Marilyn Bruyere, a great painter in our community who taught painting for many years at U of M, is now retired, but would delve into that romantic landscape, the kind of the manifest destiny of the landscape in our arts and transform them. Monty Dolak, who is also a graduate of our program, who we know him for his great posters, we know him for his humor, we know him for his great sensitivity to our landscapes. but he's also a deeply connected to the place and also is keenly aware of how the place has changed. So these aren't romanticizations, by the way. These are his attempts at giving us realistic images of Montana, its glories, its beauty, but also the indignities of industry and the problems. For example, those are rail cars transporting coal to the western states through Montana. I mean, yes, it's a gorgeous landscape, but it's also an industrialized landscape. The image that you see there on the left is the Berkeley Pit, the largest EPA site in the country. That water that you see there is toxic. So even artists who paint representationally, who paint in this kind of traditional style like Monty Dolak, are also very keen to represent Montana as it is in its highs and its lows. So I show you these artists that I think of as definitional artists: Charlie Russell, Rudy Audio, and Monty Dolak. They're all about, in some ways, transforming the arts in the state, but also educating people about what it means to be an artist in the West today. This is the work of Matt Hammond, who teaches photography at U of M. Tell me that this isn't a rethinking, a re-envisioning of what the modern West is. It's also quite beautiful. I mean, in a kind of ruined way. I mean, here we are, a state that is barely 120 something years old, right? And already we have places like this that look like they were ruined, a century ago. So I say that if you really want to see Montana's art, just go visit the School of Art. Go check out the Gallery of Visual Arts over there in the lobby of the Social Science Building, or go to the gallery in the UC. Go check out what our students are doing, because those are the people who are right now defining what it means to be an Indian in Montana, or what it means to be an artist in this great state of ours. So I think I'll end it here. I'm going to stop sharing. I don't know what time it is, and I will ask and see if there are any questions out there. And by the way, I will be back on Thursday to take questions and talk a little bit more about this conversation. So,
All right.
Professor Spencer.
Let me see if I can get you to the gallery view here, Rafael. First of all, let's give an applause there.
Thank you. Thanks for the Zoom claps.
So thank you so much, Rafael. We've got mics set up here. I asked Ray and Hannah if they would be ready with the first couple questions to get us started here. Ray, do you have a question you want to pose to Rafael? And Hannah, while you're thinking, you can get ready for there, and then we'll open it up for others there.
I do. Professor, do you find it, talk a little about the irony of, first of all, a backward-looking, like Charlie Russell, a nostalgic, backward-looking artist to the days of the noble savage, and yet at the same time, this is a government who basically tried to totally eliminate that same savage. Yeah. You talk a little bit about the irony there, and also, I'm half German, so even until well into the 20th century, I'm here to tell you, German people still, their impression of the West was cowboys and Indians.
Yeah, so that's a point well taken. On the first part, yeah, Charlie Russell is a paradoxical figure, no doubt. I mean, I mentioned that, he had this genteel upbringing, but then he becomes this rustic. I mean, even in the way he writes, he intentionally, misspells things. He writes like a local yokel talks, but that's a put on. The guy was a kind of, he crafted his own persona. And I think he was also crafting an idealized image of Montana. And that's not all a fiction. It's based in a reality he knew and understood. He spent time with Indians. He had friends who were Indians. He actually would prefer the company of Indians to the company of white people. I mean, there are these amazing passages where his wife is basically saying, you got to shape up and you got to start acting like the white guy you are, because his preference was to be out in a camp somewhere. But my point about, there is irony in that he was at the same point that he was trying to elevate his respect for the Indian, he was also giving the world an image that was in some ways cleaned up, that it was polished. And that image then becomes a kind of hermetic thing. And so people would believe that everything was fine out on the range, when actually things were not fine out on the range. That the reality was very much a kind of brutal regime, was in fact literally exterminating people. And so, and Russell was not alone. I mean, that fair that I talked about in 1893 in Chicago, the World's Columbian Exposition, that fairground where they were in fact glorifying the fact that American Manifest Destiny finally had conquered the West, there were statues of Indians left and right. So the Indian was seen as this noble savage, but now a defeated noble savage. And no matter how much respect Charlie Russell had for the Indian, his paintings participate in that message, that the Indian is defeated, and that the Indian may have been noble, but is no longer noble. So his images, I think, are myopic. They don't give us the full picture. And by the way, art rarely does. I mean, art is always some subjective interpretation.
Do you think that's a little bit of white guilt, shame, fragility in actually having almost totally eliminated, tens of millions of Native Americans from this land to raise them up to this level of nobility?
Yeah, there's actually, before Russell, you can also read the writings of Catlin, the great American painter, and he hung out with a Mandan. He painted images in the upper Missouri, and beautiful images of portraits of chiefs and the people that he encountered. And all the while, if you read his diaries, it's tragic, because he says these people are doomed. These races are going to be plowed over. And those are direct quotes from him. And he says basically what he is doing is a salvage job in these paintings, because he knows that these people are have no future in America. And it's haunting. I mean, it's horrible. It's heart-wrenching to read this from this artist, because he, on the one hand, he feels like he has clearly a lot of respect for the civilization, but he's also party to its destruction in a chilling way. So yeah, and that was 60 years before Russell.
Anna, do you want to follow up with a question here?
Yeah, I was just kind of gonna ask, because how like art is very influential in like shaping ideologies and stuff. Like what kind of trajectory you'd like to see it on going forward, and like if you think it can play some role in shaping like a better future and that sort of stuff.
That's a wonderful question. And the first part of your comment there about the relationship between art and ideology, it's a chicken and egg thing. Some people actually see art as responsive to ideology. So for example, all those landscape painters were really responding to the ideology of Manifest Destiny. So the idea comes first and then the art follows. But then there are other people, art critics, historians, who argue the opposite, that art is complicit and shapes ideology and sometimes gives form to ideology. I mean, there is no question in my mind that photography played a role in shaping government policies when it came to forestry in America or agriculture in America. In other words, the art was an integral part of selling Glacier National Park to the Congress. So sometimes the ideology follows the art, and the art sometimes catalyzes ideology. It shapes public opinion. It certainly shaped Congress's opinion. So in the late 19th century, photography became a tool in the hands of people who wanted to preserve lands, for example. They showed Pinchot, the founder of the forestry. Pinchot actually took photographs of desolate landscapes in the West in order to show to the government how these lands could be restored, how they could be preserved, how agriculture and forestry could improve these lands. So, so photography, which we think of as an art form, was actually a tool in the hands of these ideologues and people who had actually political and social agendas. So yeah, so those go they go hand in hand, often intimately. Whether one is leading the other, who knows? The second part of your question is, where would I like to see arts go? I think that Montana's art landscape is so wonderfully rich and diverse. There's room for people to paint like Charlie Russell. There's room for people to make traditional Indian beadwork. There's room for all of it. If we're true to this kind of postmodern world in which we live in, where we have to be respectful of difference and different ideas and different ways of life, then I think our arts should reflect that. And so that's certainly what I see in our art program, where the students and the faculty have a kind of diversity of imagery, because they bring a diversity of stories to the table. And so what I'd like to see is more of that. I'd like to see, you know, more Hmong textiles and more Chinese American art out of Butte, or Native American art out of the Flathead. I mean, you know, there's really no reason why we can't, in fact, embrace the great diversity of art today around the state. And I think the notion that there is one single style and one set of images or one set of stories that defines Montana, that's what we have to avoid in the future.
Rafael, I'm going to invite some of the other students to come up to the microphones if they've got questions or comments that they want to make on here. While they're doing that, come on up if you've got a question there. But while they're doing that, I can't help but notice there's a very intriguing piece of artwork behind you that we're seeing that looks very Montana-like in the sense of there's got some iconic images there. Can you just say a word about that particular piece of artwork?
Yeah, that's that painting is done by a good friend of ours, Christy Hager, who's a painter in Missoula. And this is actually her largest painting ever. It's actually pretty big. It's like, I'd say maybe, 10 feet by 8 feet or something like that. And it's a painting called Swimming with Bulls. So it's a couple of idiot fools swimming with large bulls.
It's very striking, and I've had the very good fortune of seeing it in person. It's one of my favorite pieces there. But I think
Christy
Jack
Hager is a marvelous artist.
Yeah.
And if you don't know her work, get to know it. She's in Missoula, so she does great work.
Does it have a particular story about how either how she painted it or how it ended up in your collection?
Yeah, it's really not set in Montana. It's set in Spain. There's a town called Denia, and I'll just shift my screen here a little bit. There's a town called Denia in southern Spain where, rather than running the bulls into an arena like they do in Pamplona, where they run the bulls through the city into an arena and they sort them out there, in Denia they run them to the sea, and the bulls go into the harbor, and it's in the harbor where the men separate them out. So we were just struck by that idea of individuals, human and beast, swimming and trying to, and you know, it's sort of like they're on equal footing there. You know, it's like nobody has the upper edge. So it's an interesting story. It's a place that we've been to, and so Christy did the honor of painting that scene for us.
That's
So
great. Well, I can see Jack is at one mic here. I'm going to turn the camera towards him. Jack, go ahead with your question. Just speak close to the mic.
Yeah, can you hear me all right?
Yep.
Okay, so I was just curious how you personally think that the future, like the story of Montana, would have been changed if at that like critical tipping point, like the time of like Charlie Russell, late 19th, early 20th century, if the artwork of Montana had adopted a more like modern and progressive style versus the traditional romantic.
Yeah, it would have really been very interesting. I mean, in some ways, that Russell and his friends sort of hunkering down on that kind of representational romantic image of Montana, that stuck because it was so popular. You know, people love that work. They love it from here to New York, and but if they had been a little bit more responsive to modern art, we might have had a much more open landscape. I mean, that the arts might have been more open to diversity earlier in the century. And I mean, there are places, for example, if you go just north of us to Alberta, where you had modern artists who were trained in European modernism and abstraction, painting the mountains of the Rocky Mountains. And therefore, their arts up there from Alberta all the way to BC are much more progressive than they ever were here in Montana. As a result of artists literally abstracting the mountains, seeing them as not just these kind of lovely, majestic, impressionistic places, but as actually as forms that could be abstracted, that could be interpreted, could be, painters who were responding more to like the essence of those mountains rather than what they looked like. Those modernist agendas were actually happening just north of us across the border. Whereas we were kind of stuck in a kind of 19th century way of painting and sculpting. And by the way, Montana had a lot of different artists and had a lot of different ethnic communities all around the state doing all kinds of interesting stuff. But it just, none of them ever captured the imagination like a Charlie Russell or even a John Ferry.
Rafael, I'm going to see if I can use the share screen for a moment here. We had a lot of students send questions in based on the readings, and I wasn't able to get them to you far enough ahead of time. Some of them we'll be able to talk about on Thursday.
Sure.
The other thing is they're all going to be writing, in the next 24 hours, they're all going to be writing response papers to your talk, and I'll be able to take some of the things from that. But I'm going to pick on Luke for just a moment here, because Luke had a really interesting question, and then I'll get you at the mic there. So let me get this quote up here first, and then we'll get you there. We got a little bit of time on that. Let me see if I can do the share screen on this one here. So Luke, you've got a microphone right next to you. Do you want to just go ahead and read your question here, and then you can comment on it? We'll get it for Rafael. Can you see it as well, Rafael?
Yes.
So I asked, good thing you have it for me to read because I don't remember. A theme in the readings was the historical perception of the inevitable extinction of Native Americans. To me, this seems like a meta-Freudian justification for genocide. It's society self-selecting the narrative that best alleviates guilt. My question has to do with the oblivious to our current ethical transgressions theme that you and Professor Spencer was talking about at the end of class last week. Reading about the historical perspectives of North American indigenous people is pretty disheartening. With some lag time, real-life racial inequality reflects societal racial perspectives. We have supposedly progressed from literal white supremacist ideologies, but we still have beliefs and assumptions that support the racist status quo. My question is, what are common contemporary concepts, ideas, or perspectives of Native Americans that may not be overtly racist, but still support the racist status quo and racial inequality? And what parts about how I think about Native Americans now will be embarrassing to me in 50 years?
Luke, it's a powerful question. And I don't know that I have, and it's a multivalent question, so I don't know that I have any single answer for you here. I will tell you this. I think it's in some ways it's easy for us to assume in our privileged position that we have 20/20 vision on our present circumstances and certainly on the past. And it's easy for us to sit here in judgment of people like Catlin and Russell and earlier generations, our predecessors, whether they were Indian or white or whomever. All we can do, honestly, is to try to understand the circumstances in the past as well as we can, as fully as we can. And to say that like the stories that we typically hear are not definitive. In fact, they were just one voice, one point of view, whether that point of view was the government's point of view or the governor's point of view or the author or that critic or whomever. It's one point of view. That the actual story is actually much richer than that. And it may in fact be much more hard to swallow. It may be more painful to swallow as a human story. We may not like what we conclude about Montana after we see the multiplicity of opinions about what was actually taking place here 100 years ago. And if that's true about the past, then it's also true about the present. That in fact, the most ethical position that we can take today is not to try our best to sort of hear the voices from the past as they come to us. And that may mean doing some digging. I mean, literally raising out of the buried past the stories that have been neglected the voices that have been shut down intentionally by those people who wanted their version of the stories to last. And I think your question, I think, is right, that there is, in fact, white racist suprematist ideology behind a lot of that singular story, that singular narrative of our past. So I think it's incumbent on us who live in the present, if we want to truly be responsible for that history, to hear the voices that are lost, that have been shunned or suppressed. And that's going to take work on all of our parts. So that's our relationship to the past. But I would say that we also have a relationship to the present. We do not have a clear view on the present either. We have as strong biases today from that past that we've inherited, or from our own, from whatever our prejudices come from. So we have to, I think the important thing is to understand ourselves better, understand our prejudices, where they come from, how they're formed, what power they have, because we all have some power and some privilege that we exercise. And if we're exercising those things in a malevolent way, then we're 50 years from now, somebody is going to shame us and is going to damn us for our myopia. So we have to try to be as clear-headed and as open-minded as we can right now about present circumstances. And again, it's all about hearing the multiplicity of voices out there, and checking ourselves, and checking if we aren't assuming that because of who we are, that we have the answers and that we know the truth. So that's what I would say. That's how I would respond to your question. And actually, and let me give you an example. I don't know how we're doing for time, but I do have an example of how we can correct that. I showed you an image by Edgar Paxson of Sacagawea, the woman who led and helped Lewis and Clark come west, right? That painting that we have in our collection was painted by Edgar Paxson, and it's a marvelous painting. I mean, it's a beautiful painting. She is wearing beautiful clothing. And we have at U of M, we not only have the painting that Edgar Paxson painted of Sacagawea, and this is the way he imagined her to be, right? But we also have the clothing that the model wore. We actually have the dress, because that dress was in Paxson's collection. And that dress is in the anthropology department, in a nice drawer under climate control. We have her moccasins. And by the way, those weren't Sacagawea's moccasins or her dress. They're just props that Edgar Paxson had collected somewhere out in eastern Montana. And so he puts Sacagawea, a Shoshone woman, in Plains Indian clothing. We look at the painting, we think, oh, that's truth. No, it's not truth. It's Edgar Paxson's version of truth. It's his fiction of Sacagawea. So what is our responsibility? Is it to trash Edgar Paxson for making a mistake or for intentionally distorting history? Or we give him some credit for what little accuracy there is in those? Yeah, those are moccasins. Yeah, those are Indian moccasins. Yeah, he put him on a model, and yeah, he envisioned that, yeah, Sacagawea must have worn moccasins, and they might have been beautiful beaded moccasins. More than likely, not so much. But anyway, we give him his credit due, but we also we pay attention to the fact that he was inaccurate, and that he was changing the story to make it look right in his eyes, to make it look presentable to a white audience in Missoula in 1914. Okay, so we owe it to Paxson to be truthful about his process. We owe it to ourselves to understand that history. And here's what I'd like to do. I would like to take that dress and those beaded moccasins out of the drawer in the basement of social science and put them next to the painting. And then allow people who were Dene, or people who were Shoshone, or people who were Plains, who were Blackfeet or whatever, to respond to the heritage that's discussed, that was discussed by Edgar Paxson, to talk about who Sacagawea really was, and how his version of Sacagawea is a white version of Sacagawea, that it's Sacagawea, and Sacagawea is not Sacagawea. Do you understand what I'm saying? So if we're responsible to our present, then we can look at the past honestly, with sincerity, and say, look, it's faulty. It's looking through a kind of misshapen prism. But we can come to a better conclusion. But in order for us to do that, we have to hear all voices. particularly the voices of the people who are being depicted in the paintings. So I hope that somewhat answers your question.
Rafael, I'm gonna make a comment here, and I hope you can hear me okay. Can you hear me okay through this muddled mask? I realize it's not ideal, but
Yes.
the timing of your talk is really fortuitous, because last week we had Dr. Rosalind Lapierre here, and she was talking about Montana myth making, and she contrasted the Blackfeet worldview of a world that was completely inhabited, even in places that were so sacred that they didn't go very often. They were still inhabited by different beings and things like that. So there was no empty landscape. It was an inhabited world. And she contrasted that with the Western mythology of wilderness, of coming to an empty place, of wild places like that. And a lot of the artwork you showed tonight and the readings we did in preparation were so fortuitous about that. I wanted to, and then I want to mention one other third, and I want to just read a quote here. Our speaker next week is Deborah Magpie Erling, who's going to speak to us about the lost journals of Sacagawea there in terms of that. And so we're going to move from an environmental historian's perspective to an art historian's perspective to now literary perspective. But I was really struck in the readings you had us do, basically how much I could see myself in the myth making that shaped me as I thought about the different kind of West. And I wanted to read two quotes from the landscape on Thomas Cole's there that were very striking for me. One here, he says, he's contrasting the American landscape with European landscape, and there it says, and although an enlightened and increasing people have broken in upon the solitude and with activity and power wrought changes that seem magical, yet the most distinctive and perhaps the most impressive characteristic of American scenery is its wildness. There's that quote there, and then another one here a little later on, where he's comparing the artistic achievements of the Europeans within Rome and Milton and Petrarch and so forth. He says, he who stands on Mount Albano and looks down on ancient Rome has his mind peopled with gigantic associations of the storied past. But he who stands on the mounds of the West, the most venerable remains of American antiquity, may experience the emotion of the sublime, but as the sublimity of a shoreless ocean unislanded by the recorded deeds of man. It's just so powerful again to see how the artwork there recapitulated that whole mythology of the empty continent. And you talked about it early on in Manifest Destiny and there. And so in some ways, Charlie Russell, even though he's looking back and romanticizing, at least he has peopled landscapes in some ways, in which other ones you oftentimes there. And I remember how guilty I was of this. I mentioned this in class before, but I spent my first summer after college working in Glacier National Park because I was so drawn to that spectacular wilderness scenery. I had no idea as an 18-year-old that it had been taken out of the lands of the Blackfeet people, and the Blackfeet Nation was still adjacent on its eastern side. And so Luke's question about what will we think about 50 years from now as we look back, these are questions I'm still wrestling with as I go through my 50 years of being in Montana today. My first time in Montana was back in the mid-70s, and I'm still wrestling with how to make sense of these different myth-making stories that you illustrated so nicely with the artwork tonight.
Yeah, one of the books that transformed my notions was Charles Mann's book. What was it? 1491, and then 1493. And really, I mean, the transformative part of that book is that he acknowledges that we have been sold this story over the last 500 years about America being sparsely populated, virginal lands. I think Lewis and Clark, Meriwether Lewis used the phrase penetrating virgin lands for his journey coming West, which is such a weirdly sexual metaphor. But this idea that this continent was empty and it was rife for the taking is a myth. And it was a myth that started in 1492. And it was far from the truth. The continent was populated from corner to corner, from Tierra del Fuego all the way up to the Arctic. There wasn't a square inch of this territory that hadn't been poured over, walked on, combed, cultivated, farmed, harvested, etc. I mean, this was not a continent, devoid of human activity. On the contrary, and so so I think we have a lot of we have to dislodge these notions that that history started in 1492 or in 1776. There's a history here that precedes all of us.
Well, Rafael, I'm so glad we've got to end for tonight. I'm so glad you're willing to come back and join us on Thursday afternoons for further conversation. I'll send you some more questions on that. But it's such a reminder, as you're just talking about here, we so oftentimes think about myths as stories that are not true. But myths, when they get enacted, become very, very powerful stories because they shape the way things. And you said the same thing about art. Art does these representations that then creates the very reality that it's trying to represent as people enact them and live them out. And so we'll look forward to the conversation continuing on Thursday, but thank you so much for a really fantastic lecture tonight, getting us started here. One more round of applause for Rafael here.
Thank you. Thank you. Applause for you.
And I'll send you the instructions for Thursday on that there. So thanks so much, Rafael.
Take good care, everybody.